My son gloated that I'd get nothing from my ex-wife's $34 million will. He was all smiles during the reading, but then the lawyer read one sentence that erased his grin. My son sat there, a smug smile plastered across his face. He was so sure. He was so certain that I, his father, would walk away with nothing from his mother's $34 million will. But then the lawyer read one single sentence, and everything changed. The smile vanished from Dustin's face, replaced by a look of sheer, unbridled fury. He started screaming so loudly the walls of the office seemed to shake. But that was still hours away. 3 days before the screaming, my life was still a mess of mundane problems. I was kneeling on my kitchen floor, mopping up a puddle of spilled coffee, when my neighbor's familiar, angry voice sliced through the thin apartment wall. "Your damn sprinklers are flooding my begonias again, Jerry." At 65 years old, I was still cleaning up messes that weren't entirely my fault. The phone rang. It was the 5th ring when I finally stood up, tossing the wet towel into the sink. I answered, expecting more noise, more problems. "Mr. Flores, this is Janet Morrison from Morrison Welsh and Associates in Cheyenne." The woman's voice was professional, careful, and I knew instantly that it was the kind of voice that precedes bad news. "I'm calling regarding Brianna Elizabeth Flores." My hand tightened around the receiver. No one had called her by her full name in my presence for 15 years. "What about her?" "Sir, I'm very sorry to inform you that Mrs. Flores passed away on Tuesday evening." The words hit me like a physical blow. I sank into my kitchen chair. Tuesday evening. That was 3 days ago. 3 days I'd spent worrying about sprinklers and coffee stains while the woman who had once promised me forever was gone. The simple fact that Brianna, vibrant, stubborn, impossible Brianna, was no longer in this world was impossible to process. As I sat there, her name echoed in my mind, pulling me backward in time. I was suddenly standing in Murphy's Diner on a snowy February evening in 1987, watching a woman in a red wool coat argue with the manager about his hiring practices. She was fierce and unapologetic, magnificent in her anger. The diner felt smaller when she left. She dropped her business card on the counter, and I found myself memorizing the number before stepping out into the cold. It took me 3 days to work up the courage to call. She laughed when I asked her out for dinner. A real laugh, full of electricity. I knew then and there that I was falling for her. 6 months later, I proposed to her in that same diner. "Forever," she whispered on our wedding day. And I believed her completely. When our son Dustin arrived, I thought our perfect moment would last forever. But even then, holding that perfect baby, I noticed how Brianna's eyes occasionally drifted to the business magazine someone had left on the nightstand. The landslide started slowly. Dustin grew up with a computer instead of a fishing rod. We moved to a new house, a shrine to success with a crystal chandelier and a dining table that reflected every fingerprint. Our life became a series of business dinners and networking events, conversations I couldn't contribute to. "Jerry works at the power plant," Brianna would say, and I'd hear a new, apologetic edge in her voice. Our son thrived in this new world, and he started to look at me with barely concealed contempt. "Dad doesn't understand," became his favorite phrase. "You settled for mediocrity," he told me at 17, and the words were like a physical blow. By the way, if you're still with me, make sure to hit that subscribe button. I've got more unbelievable stories on the way. The final explosion came during Dustin's senior year. Brianna missed his graduation because of a client crisis. "Family has to come first sometimes," I told her. She looked at me, genuinely puzzled. "Like what?" she asked. In her eyes, I saw the truth. We weren't a family anymore. We were a business arrangement that had outlived its usefulness. The divorce was devastating. She got the empire, and I got the old starter home we'd kept as a rental. And she got Dustin's loyalty. "You're holding him back too," he told me before he left. I was alone, surrounded by boxes of a life that apparently meant nothing to the people I'd loved most. 15 years later, I stood in the back of Riverside Memorial Chapel, a stranger at my own wife's funeral. Whispers followed me like ripples in a still pond. Her ex-husband, can you believe it? The narrative had been written long ago. I was the villain who had held back a brilliant woman. It was a story I had long ago stopped fighting. "Dad, what are you doing here?" Dustin's voice cut through the chapel's murmur. At 37, he was all polished success. She wouldn't want you here, he said, his voice dripping with barely controlled anger. You embarrassed her enough when she was alive. Don't compound it by pretending to grieve her death. The chapel went completely quiet. 200 pairs of eyes focused on our confrontation. He turned to address the crowd, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a CEO. My father seems to have forgotten that divorce means you're no longer family. A few people nodded in agreement. He pointed at me, a casual, disgusted gesture. For those of you who don't know, this is Jerry Flores, the man who spent 22 years holding back one of the most brilliant women this town has ever produced. While my mother was building an empire, he was content to punch a time clock and complain about her ambitions. Each word landed like a physical blow, a vicious summary of our marriage. I thought about defending myself, about explaining the complexity of our love and how it had soured. But what was the point? The crowd had already chosen their narrative. He took half her assets in the divorce, despite contributing nothing to her success, Dustin continued, his voice rising with righteous fury. And now that she's gone, he shows up expecting sympathy, expecting to be treated like he mattered in her life. But I was back in that lawyer's office now. The same office where I sat as Dustin gave me a smug smile, believing that I would get nothing. He had told me himself that I wouldn't get anything. The lawyer cleared her throat, adjusting her glasses. Dustin's smile seemed to get wider. He was so sure. And finally, she said, her voice cutting through the tension. To Mr. Gerald Flores. Mrs. Flores leaves you the contents of her personal safe deposit box, including her jewelry, real estate deeds, and the majority stake in Flourishing Industries. Dustin's smile crumbled. The company was worth tens of millions. It was the legacy he was sure he had inherited. The lawyer continued. As an attached codicil, it states, for the man who was never afraid to be content with his life, I leave the only thing he would never ask for, and the only thing I can give him. The chance to finally let go of this world and live the one he deserves. Dustin stood up, his face red, his hands clenched into fists. That's impossible. That's not what she told me, he screamed. But it was true. And the lawyer's simple, final sentence had not only taken everything he had worked for, but also had turned his own narrative of failure against him. It was a cold, hard dose of irony. What would you have done in my place? Tell me what you think in the comments below. The chapel fell silent. I stood there, fully exposed, feeling the weight of 200 judgmental stares. Just moments before, Brianna's son Dustin had delivered a blistering, public attack on my character, painting me as a weak, failed man who had dragged his mother down. Part of me wanted to walk out, to spare myself the continued humiliation, but another part, the part that had loved Brianna Chin more than anything else in the world, refused to be driven away from her final goodbye. Are you finished? I asked quietly, my voice carrying clearly through the hush. Dustin's eyes flashed with surprise. He'd expected me to crumble, to slink away in shame. When I remained standing, his confidence flickered for just a moment. I loved your mother for 40 years, I said, my voice steady and firm. 22 of them as her husband. 18 more as someone who wished her well despite everything that went wrong. I'm not here to make claims or demand recognition. I'm here because once upon a time, we made promises to each other that mattered, and I choose to honor that memory. I sat back down, folding my hands in my lap. Around me, the silence stretched uncomfortably. Dustin stood frozen in the aisle, apparently unprepared for resistance to his public trial. The funeral director, a man I'd never seen before, stepped forward to restore order. Dustin shot me one final look of contempt before striding toward the front pew reserved for family. As conversations gradually resumed, I caught fragments of the gossip. Nerve of some people. Poor Dustin having to deal with this. Should have stayed home. But I stayed. I sat through the eulogy that painted Brianna as a visionary who'd overcome obstacles. I listened to readings from business associates who spoke of her leadership. I endured the musical selections that emphasized triumph over adversity, all while feeling like an intruder in a world I had once been a part of. When the service ended, people filed past, offering condolences to Dustin while pointedly ignoring me. I waited until the chapel had mostly emptied before standing to leave, just wanting the ordeal to be over. I was reaching for my jacket when a voice stopped me. "Mr. Flores." A man in an expensive suit approached with measured steps. He looked younger than I'd expected, maybe 50, with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He introduced himself as Dan Morrison from Morrison, Welsh and Associates. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, shaking my hand with a firm grip. He glanced around the emptying chapel. "I wonder if I might have a word with you and Dustin. There are some matters we need to discuss regarding Mrs. Flores's estate." Before I could respond, Dustin appeared at my shoulder, his practiced grief shifting to alert interest. "Dan, finally. I was wondering when we'd handle the business side of things." Dan's voice was measured and professional. "I'd like both of you to come to my office for the reading of your mother's will." "Both of us?" Dustin's eyebrows shot up. "Is that necessary? I mean, he's not." He gestured vaguely in my direction. "Your father is specifically named in the will, Dustin. His presence is required by law." I felt a quiet flutter of surprise. Named in the will. That seemed unlikely. Maybe it was some minor formality, forgiving an old debt. I quickly tried to dismiss myself, but Dan was firm. "Mrs. Flores was very specific. Both you and Dustin must be there." Dustin, annoyed but confident he had nothing to worry about, simply shrugged. "Fine, let's get this over with. By the way, if you're still with me, make sure to hit that subscribe button. More unbelievable stories are coming." The walk to Dan's office took us 3 blocks through downtown Rock Springs. His office occupied the top floor of a restored Victorian house. All dark wood and leather-bound books. It was exactly the kind of place Brianna would have chosen. Prestigious but not ostentatious. Dustin claimed the chair closest to Dan's desk, leaving me the one slightly to the side. Dan settled in and opened a thick file folder, pulling out several legal documents. He expressed his condolences again, and I just sat there in silence, feeling like an intruder at a private family moment. Dan lifted the top document. "This is the last will and testament of Brianna Elizabeth Flores, executed on March 15, 2024. The will supersedes all previous wills and codicils." I sat a little straighter. Brianna had updated her will only 14 months ago. I wondered why. Dan's voice carried the formal cadence of legal proceedings as he continued. "The will confirms that Mrs. Flores was of sound mind and disposing memory, and was under no undue influence or coercion." Dustin leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped together, the anticipation thick in his posture. He was preparing to claim his inheritance, to finally step fully into the empire his mother had built. Dan turned to the next page, his reading glasses catching the light. "To my beloved son, Dustin Michael Flores, I leave the family home at 847 Hillrest Avenue along with all furnishings, artwork, and personal property contained therein." A satisfied smile spread across Dustin's face. The Hillrest house was worth at least $800,000. It was a substantial property with mountain views, perfect for a man of his standing. "Additionally," Dan continued, "I bequeath to Dustin the sum of $500,000, to be transferred from my primary investment account within 60 days of probate. $500,000 plus the house." I watched Dustin's reaction carefully. The smile flickered slightly around the edges. He was pleased, of course, but I could see him calculating. $500,000 was significant, but Brianna's business empire was worth far more. Where was the rest? What about Mom's business interests? The company? Dustin asked, a note of uncertainty creeping into his voice. Dan's expression remained professionally neutral. "I'm continuing with the specific bequests, Dustin. Please allow me to finish reading the relevant sections." I shifted in my chair, feeling increasingly uncomfortable, like a voyeur witnessing a private moment. "The bequest to Dustin," Dan continued, "includes the following conditions. The inheritance is contingent upon his continued employment with Flores Consulting Solutions for a minimum of 2 years following the date of this will's execution, or until such time as the company is sold or dissolved." Now Dustin looked genuinely confused. "Conditions? What kind of conditions? And what do you mean until the company is sold? Who would sell it?" The tension in the room began to creep in. Dustin's confident posture shifted. His hands unclasped and reclasped in his lap. "Let me understand this clearly," he said, his voice taking on an edge. "I get the house and $500,000, but there are strings attached? And you're talking about the company being sold? That doesn't make sense. Mom would never sell the company. It was her life's work." Dan removed his glasses and cleaned them carefully, a gesture that gave everyone a moment to process what they'd heard. "Your mother's will contains additional provisions that address the disposition of her remaining assets," he said quietly. "The company, her investment portfolio, and several other significant holdings." "Well, then let's hear them," Dustin demanded, his patience clearly wearing thin. I watched, growing more uneasy by the second. Something about Dan's manner, the careful way he was parsing his words, suggested we were approaching a territory none of us were prepared for. Dan sat back in his chair. "Before I continue, I want to emphasize that these documents represent Mrs. Flores's final, considered wishes. They were prepared after extensive discussion and consultation, and she was adamant about their contents." The room fell silent except for the tick of an antique clock. Dustin stared at the lawyer with growing alarm. Dan lifted the third page of the will, his eyes scanning the text briefly before looking up. His gaze moved directly to me for the first time since we'd entered the office. Something in his expression made my stomach tighten. A mixture of sympathy and professional obligation. "However," he said, his voice carrying a weight that felt like an announcement, "the will contains provisions for the disposition of Mrs. Flores's remaining assets, which constitute the majority of her estate." Dustin leaned even further forward, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair. "Finally," he said, "let's hear about the company and the rest of her investments." Dan returned his attention to the document, clearing his throat with a deliberate pause, like a man about to deliver life-changing news. "To my former husband, Jerry Michael Flores." The words fell into the quiet office like stones into still water. I felt my mouth fall open, a physical reaction I couldn't control. "I bequeath the sum of $33.5 million to be transferred from my primary investment accounts and securities portfolio." The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. $33.5 million. The number was so large it didn't seem real. It didn't seem to apply to someone like me. "There must be some mistake," I managed to say, my voice sounding strange and distant. "Did you say 33 million? 33.5 million, yes." Dan's tone remained professionally neutral. Dustin's face had gone completely white, then flushed red, as if his blood couldn't decide which direction to flow. "What did you just say?" "Additionally," Dan continued, apparently determined to deliver the complete bombshell, "I transfer to Jerry Flores, controlling interest in Flores Consulting Solutions, including all subsidiary companies, real estate holdings and business assets. This transfer includes 65% ownership of all corporate entities and appointment as chairman of the board of directors." I couldn't breathe. The room seemed to tilt sideways. Controlling interest in Brianna's company, the empire I'd watched her build from nothing, the business that had eventually consumed our marriage, the source of wealth that had made me feel so inadequate. She was giving it all to me. "This can't be right," I whispered. "There has to be some error." "I assure you, Mr. Flores, there is no error." Dan removed his glasses again, cleaning them with methodical precision. "These documents were prepared under Mrs. Flores's direct supervision." Dustin shot to his feet. "This is impossible. She couldn't." He turned to stare at me with an expression of pure disbelief mixed with something darker. "What did you do? How did you manipulate her?" I shrank back in my chair. "Dustin, I didn't do anything. I haven't spoken to your mother in 15 years. "The word liar," exploded from Dustin like a gunshot. "People don't just give away $33 million to their ex-husbands for no reason. You must have gotten to her somehow, convinced her when she was sick, when she wasn't thinking clearly." Dan's voice cut through his rising hysteria with professional authority. "I can assure you that Mrs. Flores was of completely sound mind when she executed these documents. She underwent a thorough mental competency evaluation, specifically to prevent any future challenges to the will's validity." I sat frozen, watching the chaos unfold. But why? Why would she do this? The question emerged from a deep place of confusion and disbelief. Dan gathered the will documents into a neat stack. Mrs. Flores left specific instructions regarding that question. She asked me to share a personal message with you after reading these provisions. A personal message? Dustin's face contorted with rage. She left him a personal message, but cut me out of everything that mattered. Dan's voice was gentle. You received a substantial inheritance, Dustin. $500,000 and a valuable property. Compared to what he's getting. Dustin pointed a shaking finger at me. You're talking about hundreds of millions in total assets. The company alone is worth more than everything else combined. The room pulsed with tension so thick I could taste it. This is fraud, he screamed, his voice cracking with rage. She was manipulated, coerced, mentally compromised. He whirled toward me, his face twisted with fury. You did something to her. There's no other explanation. Dustin, I swear to you, I said. I had no contact with your mother. I didn't even know she was sick. Liar. He slammed his palm against Dan's desk, sending paper scattering. Nobody gives away everything they've built to someone who abandoned their family. Someone who couldn't even be bothered to call when she was dying. She didn't abandon anyone, I said quietly, finding some small reserve of strength. Our marriage ended, but that doesn't mean. It means exactly that. Dustin's voice rose to a near shriek. You walked away from us. You took your pathetic settlement and disappeared into your pathetic little life while she built an empire. And now you want me to believe she just decided to hand it all over to you. Mr. Flores, Dustin, I understand this is difficult news, but I must insist you control yourself, Dan said. These are your mother's clearly stated wishes, executed with full legal authority. Dustin spun toward the lawyer, his eyes blazing. I want every document examined. I want psychiatric evaluations. I want to know every single contact this man had with my mother in the past 5 years. There were no contacts, Dan replied calmly. Mrs. Flores made that very clear when she explained her decision. Explained her decision? Dustin's laugh was bitter and sharp. So she did explain why she decided to betray her only son and give everything to the man who ruined her first marriage. She left a personal message for your father, yes. The word father seemed to hit Dustin like a physical blow. His rage flickered for just a moment, and something else showed through, a pain so deep it made my chest ache. Then the fury returned, doubled in intensity. He's not my father. Dustin snarled. My father would have been there when she needed him. My father would have supported her dreams instead of trying to drag her down. He turned back to me, his face a mask of years of accumulated resentment. You are nothing but a failed man who couldn't handle being married to someone better than you. Each word landed like a knife thrust, not because they were entirely false, but because they contained enough truth to draw blood. I had felt inadequate during those final years. I had struggled with Brianna's success. Maybe you're right, I said quietly. Maybe I wasn't the husband she deserved. But I never asked for this. I never expected this. You expected this. You orchestrated this. Dustin's voice climbed another octave. Somehow, someway, you got to her when she was vulnerable, when she was sick or scared or... That's enough, Dan interrupted, his professional patience finally showing strain. Mrs. Flores was neither sick nor vulnerable when she made these decisions. She was, in fact, more determined and clear-minded than I'd ever seen her. Then why? Dustin demanded, his voice breaking slightly. Why would she do this to me? I was everything she wanted me to be. I worked for her company. I lived the life she planned for me. I became the son she could be proud of. The pain in his voice cut through my own shock. Despite everything, the years of hostility, the public humiliation, the bitter accusations, I saw him clearly for a moment. A man who had spent his entire adult life trying to earn his mother's approval, only to discover she'd given her ultimate validation to someone else. She left a message explaining her reasoning. Dan said gently, "Would you like me to read it?" Dustin's whole body was vibrating with suppressed rage and grief. A message? She couldn't explain it to my face, but she left a message for him? The message addresses both of you, Dan corrected. I found my voice, though it came out hoarse and uncertain. Maybe we should hear what she had to say. Dustin's eyes locked on mine with pure hatred. You have no right to make decisions here. You have no right to any of this. But even as he spoke, I could see the desperate need in his expression. The need to understand why his mother had chosen to shatter everything he'd believed about his place in her world. Dan reached for another envelope, one with personal message, written across it in Brianna's familiar handwriting. He opened it with a quiet authority. Brianna knew this moment would be difficult. She asked me to read this after the will was announced. Dustin slumped back into his chair, his rage momentarily displaced by desperate curiosity. I remained frozen, afraid to hope for understanding, but desperate for any explanation that might make sense of this impossible situation. Dan cleared his throat and began reading in Brianna's own words. My dearest Jerry, if you're hearing this, it means I'm gone, and you're probably sitting in Dan's office wondering if the entire world has lost its mind. I can picture your face, that expression you used to get when I'd rearranged the living room furniture without warning, confused, but trying to be polite about it. A ghost of a smile touched my lips. She'd captured that expression perfectly, and hearing her voice, even through Dan's professional reading, somehow made her feel present in the room. I know this inheritance comes as a shock. I know you're probably thinking there's been some terrible mistake, that you don't deserve this money or this responsibility. But Jerry, you're wrong. You deserve every penny, and I'm going to tell you why. Dan paused, glancing up at both of us before continuing. I never stopped loving you. Not during our worst fights, not during the divorce proceedings, not during these 15 years of stubborn silence. I was angry with you for not understanding my ambitions, but I was angrier with myself for choosing those ambitions over our marriage. You tried to save us, Jerry. You begged me to find balance, to remember what mattered. I was too proud and too afraid to listen. The words hit me like physical blows. I felt tears starting, hot and unexpected, as decades of guilt and regret crystallized into this moment of impossible absolution. Dustin, the message continued, and I saw my son's head snap up at hearing his name. My beautiful, brilliant boy. I know you're furious right now, probably convinced your father somehow manipulated me. But sweetheart, you're not ready for this inheritance. Not yet. Dustin's face went white, then red, then white again, cycling through emotions too quickly to track. You've lived your entire adult life in the shadow of my success, accepting the benefits without understanding the responsibility. You've never had to build something from nothing. You've never had to make the hard choices that wealth requires. More importantly, you've spent 15 years hating a good man for crimes he never committed. That's not true, Dustin whispered, but his voice lacked conviction. Dan continued reading. Jerry taught me about character, about integrity, about the kind of strength that doesn't need to prove itself through cruelty or judgment. I forgot those lessons when I chose money over marriage, business over love. But I never forgot the man who taught them to me. I was crying openly now, not caring how it looked. Brianna's words were rebuilding something inside me that I thought was permanently broken. The sense that my quiet life of dignity and service meant something. Dustin, you have received enough to live comfortably and explore who you might become without the weight of unlimited wealth. Learn to build something yourself. Learn to value people over profit. Learn to forgive your father for the crime of being human and imperfect. Dustin made a sound like a wounded animal. Jerry, you're inheriting more than money. You're inheriting the chance to do what I should have done. To use wealth as a tool for good rather than a weapon for proving superiority. I trust you because you never wanted this, because you'll never use it to hurt people the way I sometimes did. When Dan finished reading, the office fell into a profound silence. I sat with tears on my cheeks, overwhelmed by the gift of knowing that Brianna had loved me until the end. Dustin stared at the floor, his entire worldview crumbling around him. Finally, Dan folded the letter carefully and placed it back in its envelope. She asked me to give this to you, Jerry. The original is yours to keep. I reached for the letter with trembling hands, holding the last conversation I would ever have with the woman who had shaped my life in ways both beautiful and painful. Dustin was the first to break the silence. This isn't over, he said quietly, but the fire had gone out of his voice. I can contest this. Mental incapacity, undue influence, fraud. There are ways to challenge a will. I looked at him, really looked at him for the first time since we'd entered the office. I saw a man who had spent his entire life expecting the world to bend to his wishes, who had never learned that love couldn't be inherited or demanded, only earned. You could try, I said gently. But your mother was right, Dustin. You're not ready for this responsibility. And you are. His laugh was bitter, hollow. You're a nobody, Dad. A retired power plant worker with no business experience, no connections, no understanding of what it takes to run a company worth hundreds of millions. For a moment, the old me, the one who had felt inadequate for 22 years, wanted to agree with him. But Brianna's words echoed in my mind. You deserve every penny. Maybe you're right, I said, standing up slowly. Maybe I don't know anything about running a business empire. But I know something your mother valued more than business expertise. What's that? I know the difference between serving others and serving myself. His face twisted with a final flash of rage. This is insane. She was sick. She wasn't thinking clearly. Your mother was 62 years old and in perfect mental health when she executed these documents, Dan said with professional finality. She underwent extensive psychological evaluations specifically to prevent the kind of challenges you're threatening. Then why? Dustin's voice cracked like a teenager's. Why would she do this to me? I don't want that chance. I want what's rightfully mine. What's rightfully yours, I said quietly, is $500,000 and a house worth nearly $1 million. That's more than most people see in a lifetime. What you think you deserved was never really yours to begin with. Dustin stared at me for a long moment, and I saw him realize that something fundamental had changed. The man he'd publicly humiliated that morning, the father he'd dismissed as a failure, was no longer asking for his approval or understanding. You think you've won? He said, gathering his coat with shaking hands. You think this makes you some kind of hero? No, I replied, and I felt the truth of it in my bones. I think it makes me responsible. He left without another word, the door closing behind him with a soft click that seemed to echo in the sudden quiet. Dan began organizing papers on his desk. There will be paperwork to complete, accounts to transfer, board meetings to schedule, he said, returning us to practical reality. The company's current management team is excellent. They can help you transition into your new role. I nodded, still processing the magnitude of what had happened. Dan, I asked, can I ask you something? Of course. Did she really love me? Even after everything that went wrong between us? He smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him all day. Jerry, she talked about you every time we met. Not about the divorce, not about the problems, about the man who taught her that success without character is just expensive failure. I walked out of that office a different man. The afternoon sun felt warmer, the air cleaner. I had work to do, responsibilities to embrace, a company to learn about and improve. But for the first time in 15 years, I felt worthy of the challenge. Justice, I realized, wasn't about revenge or vindication. It was about recognition. The recognition that character matters more than credentials. That patience outlasts entitlement. And that love, real love, never truly dies. Brianna had seen all of that, and in her final act, she had given me the chance to prove her right. What would you have done if you were in my shoes? Tell me what you think in the comments. I really want to know.